Takedown. This is a show where the hot takes of the sports world meet the numbers that prove them right or tear them down. Today is March 6th, 2020, and we are coming to you live from the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference here in Boston. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. It's great to see you all. I'm Sarah Ziegler. I'm the sports editor at FiveThirtyEight. Joining me on stage is senior sports writer Neil Payne.
Hey, Sarah.
Hello, Neil.
How's it going?
Good.
Yes, please.
Applause for Neil,
yes.
And we're also thrilled to be joined by FiveThirtyEight editor-in-chief Nate Silver. Welcome, Nate.
Hey, guys.
Nate, it's really a treat to have you. I mean, I know how slow the political calendar is right now, so I'm glad that, we could fill in the gaps for you with sports.
I actually pulled off the wake up at 5 a.m. thing to get work done, which never usually works, right?
Don't you normally just stay up until 5 a.m. to get work done?
I
Yes.
did, but I had 2 margaritas and 2 beers in 45 minutes last night because bars here close at 8 p.m. or something. So I thought waking up early would be better.
That does make sense. Well, we're thrilled to be here at Sloan among our people who care about sports and analytics, and so this is a great time for us.
Absolutely, yeah.
Neil, this is your 10th Sloan conference?
I think it might be, yeah.
That's
the
amazing.
first one I went to was the one right after they moved it from actually being on MIT's campus. So
Yeah. The first time I came to Sloan, I was like, wait, it's not at MIT? And then I got here and was like, oh, there are a billion people here. Yeah, no, it's not at MIT. That makes sense. And Nate, you've been doing Sloan since the beginning too, right?
I didn't go to the MIT one, so probably about as many as Neil.
yeah,
Probably.
we're dueling
Yeah.
for most Sloan attendance.
It keeps going back and forth between this one and the other conference center. Do you understand the analytics on that?
I don't, yeah. I mean, it does seem to be an every other year thing. So it was like the San Francisco Giants titles in the early 2010s.
Yes.
But also, yeah, I don't know, which would you give a higher ELO rating to? The current venue? I know
this
that
is
you're
like
being
a-
listened to right now.
It's a better venue, but not as well located.
Yeah, I like the Heinz location,
Yeah.
for sure.
If you combine this aesthetics with the Heinz location, you would have the best conference center in Boston.
Get on that, Boston.
We'll prepare a chart of this right after we're done recording. So on today's show, we'll discuss how 538's new NBA player rating, Raptor, has performed in its first year. And we'll take a deep dive into data with our rabbit hole of the week. On his show, The Hottest Take, our friend Bill Simmons recently had this to say about the influence of statistics in the NBA. The nerds ruined baseball, and now they're coming for basketball. We have to stop them. What a take. So this year, 538 launched its NBA player rating, Raptor, which one could argue is bringing more nerdiness to basketball. But are we really ruining the sport, or are we more accurately reflecting and understanding what's happening on the court? Nate, let's dive into this. How has Raptor performed in its first year?
So we're really pleased with it. 3/4 of the way through the year, we've been kind of tracking how it performs against Vegas team total lines as well against other systems, and it seems to be, as of a week ago, I've been a little bit busy since then. It was solidly ahead of Vegas, which is pretty hard to do.
All our polls for this are pre-Super Tuesday.
Pre-Super Tuesday, yeah. And it was kind of tied with Pippin. I know there are a lot of acronyms here, right? Pippin's another good system, right? And ahead of everything else by some margin as far as systems go.
By the way, this is the crowd to throw out just
I know.
crazy acronyms.
But now there's been a whole revolution. There's a new BPM and a new RPM. So I think Raptor is part of this kind of, I think of it as generation 3.0 of NBA metrics.
I think that's right. Yeah. If you think of, player efficiency rating as the first generation win shares, that kind of thing, then moved on to, real plus minus, box plus minus 1.0, and then now, they've overhauled, ESPN overhauled real plus minus recently. New BPM came out, I think, just in the last couple weeks at Basketball Reference, and then, of course, our wonderful friend Raptor also in the mix.
So has Raptor added to the analytics landscape in the way you intended it to, or had maybe hoped it would?
I think I'll hear people talking about Raptor, right? And we've heard stories of agents and players starting to use Raptor, and I think I've heard that obviously, there are obviously some teams, I'm sure Daryl, who have their own better versions, right? But like we think it's like
It's called Rocket. Right?
Rocket.
yeah. Regression optimized. The K is tricky.
We'll work on that.
Kurtosis, I don't know.
Nice.
But like I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of like kind of finally giving fans like a version of like kind of the way the average analyst savvy team is thinking, right? Which is not to say you can't develop innovations and other things like we don't account in Raptor for synergy between different types of players, right? We don't account for the effects of coaching. There are definitely big things, and people would say, you know, you have a pretty good perspective on offense. On defense, we're maybe kind of half the way there, right? So there's a lot of things still to look at and to improve, but I think the reason why we and like 4 other people had this idea at the same time is because there's a lot more data now than there used to be. There is a lot more ability to move beyond kind of just box score stats. And there's actually like now 6 years worth of player tracking data, or 6.5 now, 6.7, right?
Yeah.
Which is enough to like actually do something with and check out empirically and see kind of what works and what doesn't. Some things work very well and some things don't. And a lot of things work if you know what you're doing and can be a little bit dangerous otherwise.
And at first, like, we didn't necessarily know what to make. I think that even, teams were struggling to try to figure out, what do you do with this new data? How much weight do you give to it as opposed to some of the stuff that we were more familiar with and comfortable with and knew was predictive? And so now, with the benefit of more years, you do get to have that sense of, this is how we value it, how we can use it, in ways that it fills in the gaps. And in some cases, it has superseded stuff that would have been in one of the older generations of models, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, for example, like the opponent's shooting data is something where we kind of use it in kind of a half-assed way briefly, and then, but like, it turns out.
You mean Draymond?
Draymond. I like Draymond.
Now, what did Draymond stand for? I don't remember at all.
Defensive. I don't.
Yeah.
I'm too tired.
Nobody wants to hear us try to half remember backgrounds anyway.
What was Jeff Bagwell?
Jeff Bagwell. Oh my goodness. Joint estimate featuring Fangraphs and Baseball Reference. WAR equally leveling lists, something like that.
Yeah.
Jeff Bagwell, everybody, great player, Hall of Famer.
Like 2 people walked out during that.
Yeah, they're like, we don't want to hear about
with
merging
us.
wars together. Fangraphs for life.
But no, it turns out that like actually looking at 2-point interior defense is quite valuable. Looking at 3-point defense, the way the NBA characterizes shots is not very valuable. It's pretty random.
Very noisy, right? Like it's almost sort of
yeah.
totally random.
So for one thing, is if I am this far away from you or farther, right? You might still be the nearest defender on a wide open shot. That creates one problem, right? Also, you're often closing out on someone, so you might not be that close at the moment of the shot per se, but it can have like a fair amount of influence. And also, there's like quite a bit of like randomness in 3-point defense. So yeah, there are things we could use more data on. The NBA is aware of this stuff, right? We talk to them. Help defense is something, and switching, which is something that like that is problematic, right? Pressure on the perimeter. I mean, interior defense we can measure pretty well, right? But pressure on the perimeter and how you even want to approach defense on the perimeter, I think, is like a lot more of an open question potentially.
Yeah. Are we ever going to be able to solve that? The defensive metrics, just because of the complications involved in NBA defense?
I think we can get a lot. I mean, I think there's still a fair amount of low-hanging fruit, is what I would say, right? The NBA is working on different types of like pressure scores, where it's like, literally how close are you to the average man, but in ways that, for example, deny relevant passing lanes and so forth. And so they're very aware of these problems. I think we have like kind of 1 or 2 more years worth of lemonade to squeeze out of the lemons before we get into kind of the really hard interactive type problems.
Yeah, and it does seem like the next step would be something like trying to figure out sort of like spatial control, like which players are in control of what territory. We've seen this in soccer a lot with trying to use tracking data to basically say, have you tilted the court in favor, I guess in their case, the pitch, in favor of your
Soccer
team.
words right
Soccer
there.
words are happening. Look at me with that. Trying to basically map out, okay, you compared with an average player at your position or in your role, are you controlling more space on the court and limiting the opponent's, expected points per possession on that? That's probably the next step. And the great thing about Raptor is that it's modular. We can slot things into and out of it and kind of make improvements to it without necessarily overhauling the whole system from scratch.
Well, that's a good question. So what would you see right now, with what we know about the season so far, what kinds of things are you hoping to adjust for the next iteration of Raptor?
So there is some stuff in terms of like, how do you incorporate current season stats with the prior? That because we had never run Raptor in season before, we never knew what like Raptor looked like after 10 games. That we just kind of made wild guesses on. I think it was a little bit too aggressive early in the season because things kind of moved one direction then moved back, which is usually a sign that you kind of overweighted the first 15 games or whatever. And so, but we can now look at that empirically. I am kind of curious about the question of like, can you extract like a team or a coaching intangible? So Raptor actually estimates a pace rating for each player. It'll say if you put Russell Westbrook on this team, what influence does he have on the Rockets' pace, for instance? And for that, it actually kind of allocates credit between the team and the players, right? So in theory, for other types of stats, you could say, okay, well, maybe the team, maybe Brad Stevens, right, has this type of an impact on defense, right? And so you have to adjust any Celtic who leaves the Celtics and becomes another team, maybe a less adept defensive system, right? So that's one kind of somewhat low-hanging fruit that could be incorporated into the current version of Raptor.
Is there anything we can do with like player fit? Like that's a thing with the Sixers right now that is being talked about a lot. How well these players fit together. They're all really, there's a lot of talent individually, but how well they play together is a little bit trickier. So our model really likes the Sixers, but maybe the real world doesn't. So
one thing I thought, any plus minus rating accounts for the quality of your teammates. I thought about having like plus minus type usage rates, right? Where, because by definition, a team uses 100% of its possessions, right? They're allocated to somebody. And so if you have a shitty team, right, some, Zach LaVine or something will, use 35% of possessions on the Bulls, which may or may not be optimal for the average team, but probably is totally fine for the Bulls, right? But if you have like a team-adjusted usage rate, right, and maybe if that kind of team-adjusted usage rate is too high or too low, you would make adjustments to team's offensive rating. I think injuries are an area where we kind of at the kind of literal last minute actually added some logic about injuries, where if you have a severe injury, then it will deduct your future score. There are things like trying to we actually have a spreadsheet, right, where like some player will get injured. There's some Woj bomb.
That's Sarah's favorite spreadsheet. She has
my
probably logged
baby.
more minutes in that Google sheet than any human alive.
And we'll have to interpret what does out indefinitely mean, right? I don't know if there are ways to either automate that more or to enter more sophisticated types of assumptions, right? Because we'll kind of assume that like, okay, here is a player who is recovering from injury, and so we'll assign him 40% of his minutes midway through recovery, right? But it's really more likely to be playing or not. It's more of a binary that actually has some effect on the odds, right? So to simulate, like, okay, what's the chance of a Joel Embiid injury? And if that happens, then the Sixers are kind of totally fucked, right? But Joel Embiid's never partially injured, right? He's either injured, well, actually probably is partially injured, right? But he's,
all the time.
It's more binary than the model assumes.
Yeah. I think that's right. And we should also say that there's been some work done by, for instance, Todd Whitehead of Nylon Calculus had a great story just this week about basically player archetypes and their effect on fit. And so that's something that could conceivably be worked into a model where, one of his findings, I thought the whole thing was really interesting and encourage everybody to go seek it out. But perimeter scorers playing together, actually, when you put them together, your team is more efficient than you would expect just based on the individual ratings of the players. Whereas at the other end, rim protectors, the more that you pack them into a lineup, the less efficient the team is than you would expect based on just the on paper talent of the team. And, maybe the Sixers are running into a little bit of that with their size. And so those are the types of synergies that I think could be modeled in eventually. And maybe even, there could be, you talked about a team specific usage rate or like a team adjusted usage rate. You could even adjust each player's value based on what archetypes of players they would be playing with theoretically, and try to figure out like which player ports his talent across the most different teams. That's another definition of value, is like how portable is your skill set, where you can put you down in basically any configuration of lineups and you'll still add to the team. Whereas there are some other players obviously that are only really useful in very specific circumstances, and that has a tangible effect on how you build a team around them, but it might be invisible to a player rating system because it only knows about them in the context that they kind of created their numbers.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can adjust for something, you can adjust both ways, right? So you can both kind of say, okay, how will this group of players play together, and also how does that synergy overrate maybe a guy relative to how he would be on like an expansion team or something.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, my intuition is that like you want kind of teammate adjusted usage to equal 100%, and if you go either under or over, then you have inefficiencies.
That makes sense. So what do you guys think we're able to see about the league now with Raptor that maybe we weren't able to see or quantify before?
I mean, it's mostly on defense, even though defense is harder. I feel like it kind of takes us from like 30% of the way there to 55% of the way there, whereas on offense, it maybe goes from 80 to 85 or something. So the offense is better, but also it's more marginal improvement-wise. If you look at like the Raptor leaderboard on defense, then it's mostly guys who have strong defensive reputations, right? It's like Rudy Gobert and Marcus Smart and people like that. I think one thing that Raptor is really good at is like it actually is pretty balanced between the 5 positions. Which kind of reflects the way NBA teams tend to use players. It recognizes, by the way, that like tall guys provide value mostly via defense and short guys mostly via offense. I think there were some issues with collinearity. I guess this crowd might kind of even know what that means, right? But there were some issues with previous box score type metrics or BPM type metrics where, number one, assisted field goals are worth a lot less. And most big men rely heavily on assisted field goals. So these systems say, okay, well, here are these guys that have this high field goal percentage, right? But they don't seem to be that valuable in a plus-minus system, so what's going on here? And what it would do is it would say, okay, actually, it must be that offensive rebounding has no value, right? Because those Clint Capella guys who have a lot of assisted field goals also tend to be bigs who get a lot of offensive rebounds. So, like, if you have a regression equation and one part of it is kind of fucked up, then it will screw up everything else too to fit to that inappropriate model.
Because it basically looks for like offensive rebounds are almost like a proxy for the type of player that they are. And so it associates that with that type that just happens to also be, less valuable for a totally different reason, and then infers that offensive rebounds must not be that valuable as a result.
Right. So in theory, if you have a guy who both gets a lot of offensive boards and can create unassisted field goals. I mean, there are not a lot of guys like that, but like Jokic is one of those players, right? No longer Blake Griffin, but like peak healthy Blake Griffin could actually kind of, play both sides of the fence a little bit and both get some offensive rebounds and also actually create his own shots, right? Those bigs are quite valuable when you can find them.
So it's really a combination of those things, not just offensive rebounds.
Well, I mean, I think you want coefficients on your parameters. This is a really nerdy podcast.
Let's have a big hand for coefficients and parameters.
Right.
Yeah.
Woo!
See, these are our people.
They should correspond to like real life basketball actions to some extent, right? And in general, in Raptor, like we were not just optimizing everything to maximize in sample fit, because 6 years is like a decent amount of data. But it's not that much when you have a lot of collinear variables. And so it is about like, okay, you're making a lot of choices when you build a model, and kind of what's a structure that makes sense kind of basketball-wise. If you have 2 or 3 different ways of formulating a problem that perform equally well, roughly speaking, then you would stick to your priors based on other ways of estimating the value of a certain type of action and so forth. And so I think that's proved more durable, right? Like it's performing as well out of sample as it's supposed to in sample, which isn't always the case.
So let's talk about specific players and how Raptor views them. So in December, I think, we realized that Will Barton of the Nuggets was like in top 5 in our Raptor wins above replacement.
He's still 21st.
Why? Why does Raptor love Will Barton? Is Raptor right to love Will Barton?
You know, I look at the Raptor list sometimes, and I keep going down the list until I see someone and I'm like, oh, that's ridiculous, right?
How long does it usually take you?
So now it takes. So we got Harden, Giannis, LeBron James, Rudy Gobert, Kawhi, Damian Lillard, Jimmy Butler, Luka, Anthony Davis, Jokic, Tatum, Trae Young, Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday, Chris Paul, Kyle Lowry, Montrezl Harrell, okay, Kemba Walker, Karl Anthony Towns, Hassan Whiteside, getting a little, and then you get Will Barton. So right in the
number 21,
the 17 to 23%. Tim Hardaway Jr. is tied for 21st. I'm not sure I believe that either. But yeah, it's about where you start to get the NBA. There's not very much luck, right? Like if you go down like a list of like batting averages in Major League Baseball, you're going to get some guy hitting 308. It's probably a 270 hitter, right? And so there is some luck in the NBA. But look, he's a guy who shoots very efficiently. The Nuggets have been pretty good when he's been on the floor. There is an on-off component to Raptor. It's like a lot of little stuff. Right?
And I think that's like, I mean, the on-off component is a part. It's not like a huge part. It's weighted much less than the box score version of Raptor, which we should say also includes the tracking data inside of it.
Yeah.
But there is value to that when we were back testing the plus-minus component, such that it should be included and it adds to the value, but then that's where you end up with Will Barton has a great on-off split. Tim Hardaway Jr. has an even better on-off split. And I think we're straddling a line always with these ratings between how well has a player played and how good is a player. And we tend to think of those things as being the same, and mostly there's huge overlap between the two. But sometimes, like your point, Nate, about the batting average, guys can have career seasons, and it just can be because of the circumstances they're in, the role that they're in, who they're playing with. And it becomes a question, it's a valid question of how much credit do you give to the player who doesn't control the luck of being in a great circumstance, but did have to play well and perform the role well once they got put into that circumstance. This comes up a lot with, sorry, Sarah, I'm going to talk about hockey goalies for a second.
Oh, no.
Evaluating hockey goalies because they are so random from year to year. And you have to sort of say, okay, a good goaltending performance is very valuable sort of post hoc when we know that it exists. Yet at the same time, it's practically impossible to predict who will be a good goalie next season. So then do we have a bucket of value for goalies in which we just say it was luck and, kind of heavily regress every goalie to the mean and only give them credit for some small portion of their value over average? That maybe for a forward-looking perspective, that is the right call because it reflects how much you need to regress to predict accurately going forward. But if we're talking about retrospective value, especially in a system where the team is a closed system and you have to sort of add up the team value to the players on the team to equal the team's total value, then it seems weird to say, okay, well, this player had this much that falls in the luck bucket of value. And so I think that's like a constant struggle. I think in the NBA, because players are so consistent and they tend to, we don't think of luck as being as big a part of NBA player performance as we do with hockey goalies or a player's batting average in baseball.
Right. There's a lot of luck in hockey, right?
Tons of it.
Yeah.
And also in baseball. There's
Right.
luck in baseball.
I wasn't criticizing hockey for having luck.
There's too much.
I
There's
can
too much luck.
criticize hockey
There's
for
too
other
much luck in
reasons.
hockey.
There is a lot of luck in hockey.
No, and we also have so we explicitly have two versions of Raptor.
That's
one
right,
which
yeah.
is called Predator, which you can download. It's not displayable, but
That's
you can
right.
download
That's
it.
called Predator.
Predator.
Predictive Raptor. It
Yeah.
doesn't
It just makes
quite work. Don't think about it too much.
Yeah.
It's close enough. But that can show some differences, right? And I think people almost go the other extreme in the NBA where they're so deterministic they forget that there is some luck involved. Predator thinks that the Bucks have gotten a little lucky this year. I don't know why. I haven't tried to pick that apart exactly.
They've had they've played down to some opponents, I think, a little bit, right? So they have had closer games against teams you'd think that they would have blown out. Would that have something to do with that?
I mean, they have played well against the top of the league as well. There are various types of opponent adjustments, but they probably affect both versions. But it may be luck on offensive rebounding, right, or luck on 3-point shooting is a case where that can matter a fair bit.
And 3-point shooting defense. I mean, they're a team that deliberately gives up a lot of threes because they know they can kind of close out, and they don't want you to get to the rim at all, as our colleague Chris Herring wrote about a few weeks ago. And that does tend to, you are more at the whims of 3-point shooting, opponent 3-point shooting, when you play that style than maybe the average team would be. So
we talked about Will Barton as being someone maybe overrated, maybe. I don't know. Raptor loves James Harden, loves him.
Why does he love him on defense? That's the thing that I think most people would.
Although he has a positive defensive Raptor too, which surprised me.
That's what I mean.
Right.
It's surprising that he would have a positive
right. Yeah.
Raptor.
But so we give Harden. He has our highest WAR in Raptor, well above the Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's next. Is that why? Why is that happening? Is that right?
He is the most impactful offensive player since maybe Michael Jordan, and the defense I don't know about. I mean, the defense, he gets a fair number of steals, right? I think this is kind of, lazy is not the right word, right? But with the interior defense numbers, we can detect interior defenders who take possessions off, right? And many superstars actually do that. If you look at LeBron James's defensive metrics, right? When he is engaged, he is still pretty good, but he is often disengaged. It's harder to measure kind of the absence of perimeter defense, right? There's a lot of switching. If you look at the number of miles traveled, which people make fun of us for using, right? But I think James Harden doesn't do very well by that metric, but it's a very noisy metric, right? But if you look at the more advanced data on perimeter defense, on pressure scores and so forth, that is not yet in Raptor, then Harden does not do that well there, right? And so, it is funny though. There is so let's say that his defense is, he does get a lot of steals. Let's say his defense is and they're good when he's on the floor defensively.
Yeah.
Let's say his defense is league average and not plus 1.7. I think he would still be, he would fall to third or fourth in impact per possession. But because he plays so darn much, which is also an overlooked benefit of James Harden, he would still be one in Raptor wins above replacement. And one thing I kind of resent a little bit is people Giannis is so good, the Bucks only need him for 31 minutes a game, which is maybe a really good way to run the team, I agree, right? But it also means if he had to play those marginal extra 4 or 5 minutes a game, then his rate metrics would decline, right? So you do have to have some way, maybe we set replacement level too low, I don't know, right? But you have to have some way to account for the fact that it's easier to be really awesome if you're playing 31 minutes a game and can pick your spots a little bit.
I was surprised to see that Harden is a whole point better defensively than LeBron, because that's not the narrative.
Well,
right?
but LeBron, first of all, his teams, not this year, but in other recent years, the teams have been bad in the regular season when LeBron is on the floor defensively, right? And he was a case where he would kind of get the big box score stats like blocks and steals, but the advanced kind of tracking based metrics kind of reveal that LeBron is taking possessions off on defense, which is what happens when is he 35, right? A lot of superstars take possessions off. He's no exception in the regular season, and he's 35, right? But I don't know. The funny thing is in general, people are oh yeah, I like that Raptor actually likes Trae Young, right? And it likes Luka, and it likes people who are these, I guess, heliocentric players is the term now, right? But then for some reason that doesn't extend to James Harden. I don't know. I think James Harden is the most underrated player in the NBA.
Wow. Most underrated. To be clear, not for James Harden, he's not the most
not according
James Harden
to
does not
Harden.
think. He's
No, because people think he's listen like the Bill Simmons, Zach Lowe podcast.
Yeah,
Right? They're
yeah.
like, oh, he might be the 5th or 6th guy you want on a playoff team, right? I don't think that's right. I mean, you can debate 1 to 2 to 3. You can debate between him and LeBron and Giannis and Kawhi, right?
Yeah.
You can have that debate, and then if healthy, Steph Curry or whatever, right? But he's not behind Anthony Davis in the playoffs. It's ridiculous.
I'm with you, Nate, on the idea. Maybe he's not the most underrated, but maybe one of the most underappreciated superstars in NBA history.
I mean, I have a particular definition of underrated, which is because it's not like the cardinal ranking, right? Or the order. It's like, okay, so people think he's the 5th best player in the league when he's 2nd. It's only 3 points of difference, right? But it's more like it gets very nonlinear, right? And he is someone who, I don't know, I mean, the Rockets have been like a pretty darn good team, I mean, by the way, Raptor has never liked Russell Westbrook that much. Although he's played a lot better recently, obviously, and fit in that system pretty well. But people are like, oh, there are 2 superstars in the Rockets. Like, no, not really, right? There's Russ, who has turned into a very useful role player, kind of, right? And there's James Harden, and I don't know.
Maybe people mean James Harden and Robert Covington as the 2 superstars.
And Covington,
stars,
yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, so I also wanted to talk a little bit about how Raptor views rookies. We talked on our last podcast about the Rookie of the Year debate between Zion Williamson now and Ja Morant. But Raptor doesn't like either of those guys best. The favored rookie in Raptor is Terrence Davis of the Raptors. Is that just because Terrence Davis is on the Raptors? Be honest.
There's no pro-dinosaur bias.
That's just not true. We
That is
have
our
a
official
pro
position.
Yeah. We definitely have a pro dinosaur bias.
I mean, Morant is the best of the kind of heralded rookies. So here's the thing. Rookies in the NBA are terrible on defense usually and put into bad situations on offense. And if you're an NBA rookie who basically has a roughly even plus-minus rating, then that bodes extremely well for how you're going to be down the road. That's basically where Morant is, right? He's plus 0.8 on offense, minus 1.4 on defense, right? I mean, that's actually extremely promising, and the kind of forward-looking part of Raptor will like him a lot for that. But yeah, usually if you take rookies who are a couple of years older and kind of fully formed, then they're going to be probably better in the short run, right? And there's a trade out there between you can draft a guy who's a junior or a senior coming out of college and get a useful part, or a guy who went undrafted, right? Kendrick Nunn's another guy who Raptor likes a lot, although he's fallen a bit over the course of the year. But number one, it's not been. I mean, I love Zion. Where is he now?
Oh, we have to change.
He
this.
hasn't
He doesn't have enough
qualified
minutes.
yet.
Yeah,
He's not played
he's
enough
eighth
minutes.
if you
Plus 2.2.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, plus 2.2 as a rookie is crazy good, right? Not that many minutes yet, but plus 2.2 as a rookie is extremely rare. People just don't know how steep the learning curve is in the NBA, especially on defense for rookies, and so you just have to kind of adjust your priors for that. And because you can kind of see with these guys the athleticism, right? You can see the version of Morant that's going to be a superstar player, right? You can see flashes of it, but you're not watching the moments when he blows an assignment on defense. You're not watching the possessions that he uses badly.
Those don't make the highlight reels.
No, right? And maybe if he was actually on a team where, I guess the Grizzlies are competitive, right? But on a team where he was on a 4 seed or something, then it might be a little bit different. And in fact, sometimes the rookies who are on better teams, when he's Tybal, is better, but
Yeah, and that applies to Davis and Nunn also. It's probably easier to be a rookie in a reduced but highly efficient role than it is to take on Ja Morant's workload. And I definitely agree with you, Nate, to your point about that it's just important that he is close to zero, close to average as a rookie. It's not really, I don't think, as much about the degree to which you're over average. Maybe Zion Williamson could be proving that wrong, but you don't want them to come out and play like RJ Barrett, basically. That might be a red flag, as long as they don't avoid the really, really bad sub-replacement rookie season, then, they're going to be
Colin
fine.
Sexton, Kevin Knox, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. The Sexton Knox provision. I don't know what we would call it.
This is the part of the show where we stop briefly to bash on the Knicks, which is always a fun part. So in the rest of Bill Simmons' hot take that I read a little bit of earlier, so he goes on to explain his frustration of watching sports and feeling a certain way about players, but then having data contradict that feeling. He claims it makes the games harder to enjoy. Nate, do you think Raptor is contributing to that kind of cognitive dissonance, or would you argue it's making our viewing experience better?
I mean, I think Raptor actually comes a lot closer to what smart NBA fans think than like the Generation 2 metrics. It certainly captures on defense players who have good defensive reputations, with some exceptions, but not that many, right? It captures the fact that, like, hey, actually, scoring is good, right? Scoring a lot of points is a good thing
You
to
heard
do
it
as a
here
player.
first.
Whoa.
Folks.
It does not have centers being the most valuable offensive players in the league. It does not overrate the importance of rebounding, right? And so I think it actually kind of gets you part of the way there. You know, again, things like help defense, these teammate interactions are hard to model potentially. But also, again, measuring how well a guy has played, how much value he's contributed, how good he is, you know, what he projects going forward. These are all kind of subtly different things, and people kind of conflate them with one another. And to force you to have, in Raptor's case, both Raptor and Predator, to have two separate definitions, but say this is mathematically how we're going to define this, right? And there's a lot of thinking about, like, what is the right way to establish the problem? Like, what are we trying to solve for and optimize? And then you can say, okay, you know, Bill, you might have a different view on a player, but like you're trying to solve for something different than Raptor is, right? Yeah.
And this gets into a lot of those complaints about the Rockets that you always hear on Twitter, people complaining about, you know, their style of play being ugly or, you know, unwatchable. And I do think that it is sort of they're after something different than maybe Adam Silver is after out of basketball.
Wins? I
They
think is what they're
want
after.
wins. Yes, exactly. You know, they want wins and have sort of determined the best way to try to get that. And does that automatically equate to entertainment product? Not necessarily, but that's not really on the Rockets to modify their play style to be more entertaining. If it hurts their ability to win, maybe it's incumbent upon the league instead to be able to, you know, not incentivize teams to play a more, you know, a less visually appealing style. And there are a lot of great people at the league that are sort of gaming out these things all the time, trying to figure out, you know, how do we make a better product for the television? It's like a different, you know, the Rockets are one franchise in the league, and there's a whole other wing of the NBA product team that's, you know, sort of trying to work on the aesthetics of the game.
Well, the new Rockets are fun to watch.
The new Rockets are more
also.
fun.
They just decided to get way shorter, and then it's like, oh yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of space.
Short players are
obviously.
fun.
Yeah, short players. I'm all
There's like
about.
two guys up in every possession, right? And Westbrook is now used in a way that's a lot of fun, right?
I also kind of dispute the premise. Maybe this is just me being contrarian, but what we think of as visually appealing or aesthetically appealing or entertaining changes all the time, right? And so if you're used to one style of play from when you watched Michael Jordan or whatever, then yeah, maybe you don't love the Rocket style of play, but that doesn't make that necessarily the best or the only type of play. So I think the more we get used to, like when I watch a Bucks game, I'm not like, ugh, another three-pointer. I mean, I think we're getting more used to that, right? Also, I love three-pointers. I've never really understood the anger towards three-pointers. Yeah, come on,
mentality.
Yeah,
three-pointers.
have you watched like an old NBA game ever?
They're ugly.
It's
Yeah.
terrible. They're all
Yeah,
just
yeah.
standing around.
And fouling whoever
And fouling one
tries in
another.
the lane, right?
Yeah.
What's fun about that? I don't know. I don't need mid-range shots. Give me dunks and threes, and I'm good. So the player tracking data is a significant component of Raptor. In the most recent collective bargaining agreement proposed by the NFL Players Association, there's a clause that would prohibit player tracking data from being used in contract negotiations. Neil, what do you think about that proposal? Why are players wary of that data?
Yeah, that's really interesting because on the one hand, you kind of look at that and think, are we going to be judging salaries based on yards still, you know, for years and years to come? But I think also at the same time, The players are wary of it because we've seen sort of how it can be used against them, how it can shift the yardsticks that they go into their career thinking that they're going to be rewarded for, and it makes for such a more moving target. And to our point earlier that we were talking about with needing time to be able to kind of fully process the meaning of this data. In the NFL, it's way more complicated than it was in basketball, and we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface of what it means in a much easier to model sport, at least at the individual level. So I don't blame them for sort of not wanting that to instantaneously be put in, and I think if it was. And they knew what they were being judged on, there are ways that you can kind of game things. I go back to hockey, great example. When Corsi shot attempts basically were known to be a benchmark that players were using to be, for contract negotiations, and that they were being judged on in their teams, players started shooting really low quality shots at the net just to kind of juice. Oh yeah, for sure. Just to juice the Corsi numbers for their team when they were on the ice. And it became sort of a meaningless target. I think anytime you know what the target is, it devalues it in a certain way. And so I think, that is a risk also with
well, and the more you're using proxies instead of, so puck possession, I think, is important in the NHL. Right?
It is, yes.
But if you're using shots to measure puck possession, then that is a discontinuity.
And there could be proxy. You mentioned the miles traveled for perimeter defense.
Yeah, in theory, if Raptor, you could run around a lot.
You could run around in cirles and
Raptor's getting really high.
Defensive Raptor. And maybe that's also one of the concerns with the player tracking data in football is just the unexpected ways in which it might lead to different players being valued for things that they can kind of game.
But isn't that already the case just with regular stats? I mean, so Russell Westbrook gets criticized for like getting every rebound because his teammates are like, no, go ahead. So like, and wasn't that part of if he were in a contract negotiation?
The NBA has kept track of contested versus uncontested rebounds, which is pretty important. Also, offensive rebounds are like 3 times more valuable than defensive rebounds, basically. You can also look at what type of shot the rebound was received on. So rebounding a free throw miss, the defense gets that ball 90% of the time. Therefore, it's not as valuable as like a missed layup. Actually, that goes back to the offense like 37% of the time. And so it's much more valuable to secure that rebound defensively.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think players could already go, have their agents go and say, I had this many more rebounds than anyone else on my team, and that already might not have been indicative of whether that player was actually valuable to the team. So it feels like kind of a straw man a little bit.
Which players tend to produce more offensive rebounds from their shooting is a bit of an underrated quality. Guys who are like slashers, right, who finish around the rim a lot, you actually, again, missed layups result in an offensive rebound fairly often. 3-pointers less, but mid-range shots really not very much at all. So in fact, if anything, mid-range shots are even worse than their reputation because they don't result in offensive rebounds very often.
Okay. All right. I think we can leave that there. Raptor is super fun. We're going to be excited to see how it, over the whole season, how it compared to past versions of our NBA predictions. So that'll be something to keep your eye on once the season is over.
Yeah, and it's actually... So for years, we kind of lived and died by ELO. And ELO loves the hot hand, right? ELO, kind of a team would go on a 10-game winning streak. It's like, this team is the best team since, Bill Russell's Celtics, right? I do wonder if some blend of ELO and Raptor might predict better. Because Raptor's almost like, you know what? This regular season stuff, 82 games, who cares? We have good priors about how good the teams are, right? It's almost the other extreme where it kind of almost seems to ignore the regular season. So I think maybe having some mix of those to account for a team's current form, so to speak, might be worthwhile.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll leave that segment here and move on. All right. Ready?
Yeah. Do we want to do the...
No, we're going to skip
right.
the ad read in. Yep. I'm not going to make you guys listen to me read an ad for ZipRecruiter. You can just...
ZipRecruiter.
You just imagine it. It's ZipRecruiter.com/takedown. Okay. At 538, we often find ourselves falling down various rabbit holes of data. Some lead to stories, some don't. We end each week's show with one of these descents, the hot takedown rabbit hole of the week. Neil, take it away.
Sure. So this week, I wanted to use the rabbit hole to plug an interactive that will be launching soon. It's by our colleague, visual journalist Ryan Best. And we know visual interactives, they work great in the podcast medium. But I'll try to do my best to talk through the data and the interesting things that he found. So basically, he's been gathering data on all NBA player contracts, at 514 contracts to be exact, to plot their salaries against their production as measured by, you guessed it, Raptor. And so according to his analysis, first, there were some obvious clusters of players that jumped out. There were the superstars who are earning every penny of their huge deals. These are players that are getting paid at least about $17 million and are on pace to have at least 10 wins above replacement by the end of the season. There's currently only 9 players in that category, and the 3 most cost-effective superstars in the league have been, no surprise, James Harden, LeBron James, and Giannis Antetokounmpo.
You've heard of them.
Those are the 1 through 3 in Raptor war in general. And I think it's telling because due to the max salary rule in the NBA's collective bargaining agreement, you basically can never pay these megastars enough money to really fairly compensate them for the amount of value that they generate. So the NBA's basically made LeBron a bargain, as amazing as that is to say. There's 2 other classes of really cost-effective players. There's young stars who are still on their rookie contracts, so Luka Doncic jumps out in that. And then hidden gems like Duncan Robinson of the Heat. These guys are on super cheap deals. Maybe they were undrafted, maybe they were drafted really late, generating a ton of value, and you can build a whole team around these types of players. Miami actually has done that a lot, getting tons of production out of younger, cheaper guys, next to Jimmy Butler, of course, and they currently have the league's 8th best efficiency margin. But we aren't really here to focus on those good players providing value to their teams. We want to talk about the opposite kind of players, those who have been raking in the cash but not really playing well, or at all in a lot of cases. So in Ryan's research, he found that there were 50 players this year that are getting paid a combined $234 million despite not playing a single game. 0 games played between all these players. Now, a lot of it can be explained by injuries. So John Wall, Kevin Durant, and Klay Thompson alone make up $108 million of the 234. But there's some funny ones on there, like, for instance, players who are being paid a ton of money but are literally not on the team that is paying them anymore. So Miles Plumlee, he's getting paid $12.5 million by the Grizzlies right now, and he's currently playing for the Perth Wildcats of Australia's National Basketball League.
Go Perth.
Go Perth.
Perth.
And meanwhile, Josh Smith, you guys remember Josh Smith? He hasn't played an NBA game in 854 days, but he's being paid $5.3 million by the Pistons this year. And so those are the least cost-effective players in the game because you can't really help a team win if you are literally not in the NBA.
It's harder. Maybe they're helping the team by not playing.
Well,
in
yeah,
some
I
of
mean,
those
you know, we
cases,
saw
right?
some of those Josh Smith shooting years from 3. But the Josh Smith tidbit also made me think of a really funny footnote from NBA history, just speaking of players who are paid despite not being in basketball. So I thought back to a particular trade in February 2008 that made Keith Van Horn $4.3 million despite not having played a single game in 2 years. So the Mavs needed to make a trade. It was a Jason Kidd trade with the Nets, and they needed to match salaries. They thought they had things worked out. But then one of their players used his bird rights to decline a trade and block it, and they needed to scramble to match the salaries or the trade would fall through, and it was very near the deadline. So they called up Keith Van Horn, well, probably Keith Van Horn's agent, and they used a cap hold that they had on him. And a cap hold is when a team holds on to they never officially renounce a player's rights. They just hold on to them. They're almost certainly retired by that point, but they keep them, especially if they're over the cap, in order to potentially include them in a trade to match salaries, because salaries have to match within plus or minus 25% of the amount going in and out. So all of this was to say that Keith Van Horn's $4.3 million salary cap hold was then used to match the salary with the Jason Kidd trade. And so one day Keith Van Horn, 2 years after playing, got a call from his agent and was like, Keith, I got good news for you today. You just made $4.3 million. And all he had to do was like fly to New Jersey, take a physical or something, fail the physical, obviously, and then, he was able to cash that money in. And it used to be a very common practice. I think it's a little bit less so now, but especially for teams that were over the salary cap for a long period of time, to just hold on to these players' cap holds. And the players, of course, they would never officially file their retirement papers with the league because that would sort of, end the possibility to use them as a cap hold. And so it was a mutually beneficial thing because even though it was rare, on the off chance that they needed to be included in a trade, Keith Van Horn style, they could potentially make money off of it. So as recently as 2014, I want to read off some names to you that were still on the Los Angeles Lakers list of cap holds, okay? Ron Harper. Remember, this is 2014. Karl Malone, Theo Ratliff, Horace Grant, John Sally, Mitch Richmond. All of those guys could theoretically have been included in a trade that the Lakers made as recently as 2014, even though they were like stars of the 1990s NBA. And I'm not sure if they closed this up in the most recent CBA. But it's always fun to me to think that potentially Karl Malone could have made $1.8 million like a decade plus after he played in the NBA if he had been included in a trade.
I really love that. I feel like other employers should do that. I think 538 should. Yeah, could hold the contract rights to someone just in case we need to make a trade with like the New York Times.
So we can trade Harry Enton.
Yeah.
Harry Enton would, still we'd have a cap hold.
What
on
did we
him
get back
CNN.
from CNN for?
we get anything from CNN. We let him go as we thought we could re-sign him, right? We should have traded him with a year to go.
I know. We missed our
we
draft
really
pick there
misplayed
too.
that.
Yeah.
Who was our GM at that time? I don't know.
So I think we have a little bit of time left. If you guys have any questions for us, we have maybe 8-9 minutes left before we need to vacate the premises. Yeah.
I mean, like I said, tracking defensive pressure on the perimeter, having some way to quantify switches and who's picking up which players. We've thought about because there are some things where we just kind of impute positions. We thought about, shouldn't players actually have separate positions on offense and defense, right? Where Ben Simmons is a point guard on offense, but like a small forward on defense, right? Those are things we've thought about a fair bit.
Yeah.
I was curious, how does Raptor or the future take into account things like momentum within a game? I was at a Blackhawks game the other night, and it seemed like every 2 minutes they were scoring a goal. Sometimes teams get in a zone or the other team is psyched out, and how does that impact the numbers?
So there's almost the opposite problem in the NBA, where there are very, very large and profound score effects, where teams will play much worse with a 15-point lead than you would think based on the quality of their players. So you need to account for which teams leave their guys in blowouts. Those players will actually be underrated. It sounds a little paradoxical, right? But it'll be underrated because teams don't play very well in blowouts, and so so Giannis, for example, because the Bucks remove him in blowouts, it actually helps his metrics. And therefore something you have to account for potentially.
But we do adjust for that in
do,
Raptor.
yeah.
There's a score effects adjustment in there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Yep.
I mean, it is ironic. Our old
likes
system.
The Raptors. I don't
Well,
know.
it has them with a 5% championship probability.
Well, I mean, that's probably higher than a lot of places would think, but no offense.
Yeah, we're not going to take any grief from Torontonians.
I know. Now, you can't fault it. We were way up on the Raptors last year, way more than anyone else. So we earned some goodwill.
I mean, there is something where a lot of there are not necessarily, except maybe the Bucks, right? There are no kind of playoff teams that have a complete, awesome 8 or 9 man rotation, really. And so teams benefit from shortening the rotation a little bit in the postseason. Teams will have superstars play. If you have a guy play 39 minutes a game instead of 35, right? It's actually fairly material for a lot of teams. And so shortening the rotations is something that doesn't benefit the Raptors as much.
Also, the Raptors have been so injury plagued this year, and we do, we account for injuries in their game odds. So, I mean, that's got to be part of it too. I mean, the fact that they did so well without so many of their guys is sort of amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
If I understand correctly, you don't use any deep learning in any of your prediction models right now. Where do you see the importance of deep learning, and will that change in your models in the future as part of?
I happen to think that like sports and politics are two fields where we have like pretty strong theoretical understandings of the systems we're studying, right? And so it's kind of better to like impute your own priors and impute your own structure on the data. And also we're doing kind of a particular type of prediction, right? Where you want prediction with confidence intervals, which can be a problem for some technologies like that. It's not classification as much. I mean, it's just kind of like, there are no problems that I'm aware of that we want to solve to which like deep learning is a solution, you know what I mean? But we also like kind of, I don't know, right? We also are not really in a big data environment. We're in kind of small to medium data environments. We're also taking data that's more downstream, like I said before, right? You ideally don't want a metric like miles traveled, which is an imperfect proxy for what you really want to measure, right? And in the NBA, we often have like direct proxy, like you want to score points, right? So points are a good metric for scoring points, you know.
Whoa.
So the fact that you can take data that's like either been processed or is kind of fairly downstream. I mean, there's some stuff, right? Like you can maybe use machine learning on when assists are classified in a certain way, right? There are clearly some biases in what home scorers do. On the other hand, you know, clearly there's value like the purely algorithmic definitions of assist. Like, okay, if a guy dribbles 4 times and then shoots as a potential assist, like that actually doesn't really hold up very well. That official scores actually do add some value. You know, I think machine learning could be useful in imputing positions on defense. So there are some things now that I think about it. So I take that back.
We've changed our mind. Okay, one more question. All the way in the back. I mean, we rely a lot on the metrics, obviously, because we believe in the metrics more than the eye test.
I mean, it does cause, you know, I think when there are like weird results, it can sort of flag things that then you have to try to, it's incumbent on the metric to be able to explain why a certain result is coming up. And, you know, you can, when there's a disagreement between either the eye test, the conventional wisdom, or literally what everyone else is saying, you know, if you're kind of coming out with a result that's different from the consensus of other statistical models even, I think it's important to try to unpack that and figure out why it's saying that. And so it's sort of like the onus of responsibility does shift to the metric that's sort of aberrant in that case. So I think there's value to both. I mean, there's, you know, it's a check and balance system, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's why we're like, wait, is James Harden that much better than Giannis Antetokounmpo? You know, so it's not like we don't trust our eyes at all, but I think being stats people, we believe in the metrics that we build and kind of go with that as much as possible anyway. I
mean, the eye test should ideally be to have you ask hypotheses of the data, right? Here is something which this player seems to do well that is not currently rewarded in your system, right? Why is that, right? Well, maybe it turns out that doing this one thing a certain way actually has negative trade-offs, and so it doesn't turn out to be that valuable. But maybe it's also like, okay, actually, if you kind of scratch the data in a different way, then you can tease this out. Or maybe it's actually, hey, you're right, this is probably really valuable, but it's not tracked to a way that we can really account for right now. And so, no, I mean, the eye test can be valuable for those reasons. I think for like MVP awards, people are looking at team context and stuff like that, right? And implicitly, like the kind of MVP formula is like, are you the clear best player on one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the league, right? And by definition, like Giannis would qualify, right? And so I don't really have a problem with it, but people should like separate that out from best player per se.
Yeah.
I mean, also like the uncertainty is high enough where like, you know, I think some metrics have Giannis as the best player, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, it's not like we take Raptor to be totally foolproof.
It is the gospel truth.
I mean, okay, we do.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think you can distinguish between, if a player is apart by even like 1 or 2
Yeah.
WAR, it doesn't mean they're necessarily better.
So that's all the time we have, but I still have to do the outro. So stay with me, okay? That will do it for this week's show. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you guys for coming out at Sloan to see us. We really appreciate it. And we'll be back in your... Thank you. We'll be back in your feed next Tuesday. If you like what you heard, please subscribe. Everyone here should subscribe. You all subscribe, right?
I'm sure they
Yeah,
do.
for sure. Please also review and rate the show. Do it. It really helps. And I read every single review, so please.
She does.
I do,
Don't
obsessively.
hurt Sarah's feelings.
You can also email us at podcast@FiveThirtyEight to tell us what you think. Our podcast producer is Grace Lynch. Today is Grace's last show with Hot Takedown. We will miss her terribly. Tony Chow is normally in the control room, but today he's been just off stage. And our podcast commissioner is Chad Matlin. For Neil and Nate, I'm Sarah. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time. Thanks, guys.